Finally, Gonzalo Lira is with us. Gonzalo, you gave us another scare last week. We are so happy to see you safe and well. We pray for your safety, to be honest.
Thank you.
And we look forward to what you have to say. Since we last spoke, the boundary, if you like, or the lines on the map have been seesawing back and forward. The supporters of Zelensky were rejoicing just days ago about Ukrainian breakthroughs and so on. They're not rejoicing now. Tell us how the war has ebbed and flowed from your standpoint.
Well, from my standpoint, I'm in Kharkov, in the city of Kharkov. And when was it? September 9th, there was simultaneous strikes by the Russian forces. They hit like about a dozen targets all in one go. And then on Sunday, when we were supposed to speak, they knocked out the lights, and they did it again on Tuesday. It's sort of like to prove a point, but there's also been some shrewd guessing that it might have been to shut down the electrical system in the country so as to slow down the movement of troops and materiel, because the train system works on electricity. And the Zelensky regime does not have the gasoline necessary to move all that equipment on the roads. And so knocking out the electricity sort of like freezes a bit the movement of troops on the side of the Zelensky regime. But those are speculations. Nobody's really sure why Russia on September 9th for the first time hit targets within the city and hit them hard, but just the one go. And then on Sunday last, and then Tuesday again, they knocked out the lights. Nobody's clear why, but I've said this before many times that the Italians are very good at food, and the French are very good at fashion. But the Russians, they're good at war, whatsoever you might think of them. And they don't make a move unless they have a clear plan, a clear priority. They never act impulsively. And so whatever movements they've been doing have been very deliberate. And that includes the offensives that have taken place over the last few weeks that have been, quite frankly, an unmitigated disaster for the Zelensky regime, because the losses are just, they are obscene at this point. There were essentially 3 offensives that took place in the last days of August and into September. This is the famed offensive that the Zelensky regime was saying that they were going to do, that they've been talking about it since April at least, or at least that's, I remember hearing that they were going to do it starting in April, that it would be an August offensive. And the days of August were sliding by and no offensive. And finally, there was an offensive. Now, the rumor that seems to be credible is that Zaluzny, who's the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, was against these offensives because he wanted to husband the resources of the Zelensky regime military and perhaps do an offensive next spring. But Zelensky, for various reasons, especially to show off to his Western sponsors that the war in Ukraine was still a viable business venture, there was a big meeting on September 8th with his American sponsors. And so they launched this offensive, and they were on 3 fronts. From the south, it was in Kherson, then slightly to the east of Kherson was the Zaporozhye offensive, and then on the eastern edge of the contact line, it was in the Kharkov region. I'm in the city of Kharkov, and the region that was in dispute is approximately 40 kilometers from where I am. And so there were these 3 offensives, and long story short, insofar as Kherson offensive was concerned and the Zaporozhye offensive, it's credibly estimated that over 4,000 Ukrainian soldiers were killed in each of those offensives. That is a total of 8,000 there. In terms of casualties, it's not known, but the typical figure is usually it's 2-to-1 to 3-to-1. So in addition to those 8,000 men killed, likely an approximately 15,000 more troops severely wounded, incapacitated. So that's a loss of at least 23,000 men. And in the Kharkov offensive, well, this has been much vaunted. At the time that it happened, both sides were a little bit hysterical. The Zelensky regime cheerleaders thought that this was a great victory, that this showed that the Russians could be beaten, blah, blah. And on the pro-Russian side, a lot of people also got hysterical and saying, "Oh, we're losing the war, and this is a disaster," and whatnot. But in any large confrontation like this, there are always going to be ebbs and flows, and there are always going to be setbacks and breakthroughs. What happened, though, it's becoming increasingly clear, and most serious commentators will agree with what I have to say, is that the Russians knew that this offensive in Kharkov was coming, as well as the ones in Kherson and Zaporozhye. Insofar as Kherson and Zaporozhye, for all of the men that they threw into battle, the front lines didn't move an inch, not as a practical matter. There is one particular salient that has been created by the Zelensky regime forces, but in Kherson Rug, I have a hard time pronouncing the name of the city there, the Russians destroyed a dam specifically in order to flood the river. This river, as it flooded, it wiped out the pontoon bridges and cut off the salient. And so now the salient doesn't have the possibility of resupply, reinforcements, or retreat. And it's slowly being destroyed right now as we speak. And there are credible estimates of between 3,000 and 7,000 men in that salient. And so this will be in addition to the losses that I mentioned before. Now, insofar as the Kharkov offensive, the Russians knew that this was coming. That Kharkov flank was being guarded by Rosguardia, who are basically border guards, territorial militia type. They're not just second tier, but third tier soldiers. They're not even supposed to be properly soldiers. They're more akin to military police. And those people, and many of the civilians who had been assisting the Russians, and evacuated quite some time ago. And so one was that Alexander Kuris put it very, very well, that for all intents and purposes, the Zelensky forces were pioneer. By the way, do you hear me still, or because on my end it's sort of frozen?
I do hear you.
Hello?
I do hear
Hello?
you. Although it's, I do hear you. Please stay on the line. I want to respond to one or two of the points that you made, Gonzalo. If it had been the Americans and the British, all of your electricity, power, and dams would have been destroyed in the first hours of the war. I'm not looking in the crystal ball about that. I'm looking at the record of the invasion attack on Iraq, for example. Not just the big war in 2003, but the smaller war against Iraq in 1990. The first things that were incapacitated were the electricity supply, the sewage and water supply, things that contributed mightily to the death of large numbers of children through insanitary conditions, lack of clean water, and so on. So
Yes.
The Russians waited 6 months to knock out your lights. We wouldn't have waited 6 hours before doing it. You want to respond? Come back.
Yeah, I'm back. We got cut off. Anyway, what I was saying is that they had a reason to do that, and whatsoever that reason might have been, it's obscure to us. But they have this kind of attack of hitting any kind of civilian infrastructure is always done for a military reason. They destroyed the dam at Kherson Rog. And they did it for a specific reason. It was not to flood the city or to prevent the citizens from getting water, but rather so as to flood the river, which would cut off a salient that has emerged in the Kherson offensive. And so the Russians, they always have a clear plan and a clear military goal insofar as any attack that they stage. Now, insofar as the Kharkov offensive, my colleague and friend Alexander Mercouris said it best, that the Russians knew that that offensive was coming, and there was a great deal of hysteria on both sides claiming that this was a great victory for Ukraine, a great loss for Russia. Looking at it after the fact, it was in fact a very spectacular defeat because over 4,000 men were killed in the Kharkov offensive. Most of them, the vast majority of them, on the Zelensky regime side. Insofar as the Russians were concerned, they knew that this offensive was coming, and they decided that rather than defend this area that had no real military value, they would pull back to the river that was to the east of them, get behind that river to fortified positions that they've already prepared, evacuate both the military personnel and the civilians, and let the Zelensky regime forces walk into this empty territory and pound them with artillery. Because you have to keep in mind that when you are in two defensive lines, when you decide to attack, you have to get out from your defenses and expose yourself. And if you don't have air defense systems or aircraft that can support you, you're going to be exposed to the artillery and the aircraft of your opposition, which is exactly what happened. And so it's estimated, credibly estimated, that in this offensive in Kharkov, the Russians lost just a couple of hundred people, including prisoners of war, whereas the Ukraine side suffered 4,000 dead and likely, but it's not known, but likely an additional 8,000 to 10,000 wounded, incapacitated. So altogether, these three offensives in Kherson, in Zaporozhye, and in Kharkov, they credibly cost the Zelensky regime some 12,000 men and an additional, possibly as high as an additional 24,000 casualties in terms of wounded, incapacitated. This is catastrophic. Even if you look at the most conservative figures, it's likely that they lost about 25,000 men. It's going to be a range, and we'll never really know, but between 25,000 and 36,000 men. That's roughly the expected losses that they suffered. And they didn't gain anything except cow country in the Kharkov region. And so now
you mentioned something, Gonzalo, that I was going to raise with you, which is the tension that appears to be emerging between the military leadership in Kiev and the political regime of Zelensky. Now, of course, Poroshenko, the ex-president of Ukraine, who is under criminal indictment by Zelensky, has close ties to the Ukrainian military. And the release of the news, I've actually read the paper, that's how widely it's been released, which indicated the opposition of the military brass to these quite clearly sponsored offensives that were launched by Zelensky. The military brass were very clearly saying they did not want to do this. They wanted to wait until they had the weapons that could reach deep inside Russia, till they had the men and the materiel. It was Zelensky who drove these two highly expensive offensives. Is this pregnant with political change in Kiev? Could we see a military coup in Kiev?
That's a good question, and I can't possibly know, to tell you the truth, to be quite frank and upfront about it. And frankly, nobody can really know. That kind of inside baseball kind of minutia of the political machinations between the various factions in Kiev, nobody can really know. And anybody who claims to really know is probably lying. Because all that kind of palace intrigue, you only find out about it long after the fact, long after the conflict is over. What is happening at this time, I don't think it's particularly productive to be very concerned about that, because you're never really going to know. And so I'm very pragmatic in that sense. I don't bother with that kind of inside baseball issue, because there is no way to credibly know. There are rumors that the military was very much against this, that Zaluzhny wanted to wait until the spring of 2023 for any kind of serious offensive. But now that this offensive has happened, rather than doing the sensible thing, which would have been, okay, we scored a victory, let's see about negotiating a ceasefire with the Russians, they're doubling down because they're believing their own public relations. They're believing their own baloney. And what they want to do is another offensive. Now, if the Zelensky regime keeps on having these victorious offensives, they're going to wind up losing the whole war because no army can sustain this level of casualties. This is the key issue, that the number of dead and wounded incapacitated is astronomical. You have to understand here, in these three offensives, you lost for sure at least 10,000 men. This is for sure. And the likely number is closer to 12. And in terms of the wounded, you've got another 20,000 that you lost. Altogether, you're talking 30,000 men who are out of commission. That is the size of a decent-sized stadium. You cannot continue a war, defensive war in this case, with those kinds of losses. But now they're doubling down because they're believing their own nonsense. They believe that they had this glorious victory in Kharkov because the propaganda has gotten away from them and they're living in a kind of fantasy land. And which is really what the West is, what's happening in the West, because the West, they keep on going with these sanctions and they don't realize that in this winter, people are going to go cold, dark, and hungry because of the sanctions, because they've so internalized their own propaganda, they don't realize that they have been lying to the public, and now they have started to believe their own lies. They've lost touch with reality. And I'm equating the Zelensky regime with the European leadership, because the Zelensky regime, as we all know, is a puppet of the West. And they're just driving themselves and the country of Ukraine off a cliff. And so I was deeply disturbed
believing their own baloney, Gonzalo, is a phrase that will ring and live. But I'm very, very happy. I'm seldom as happy as I am now to have re-established contact with you. May God protect you and that we talk again soon. Thanks for joining us on the Mother of All Talk Shows.